I always believed that trust was the foundation of any strong relationship. Whether it was with family, friends, or the people closest to us, trust was something sacred. And for the longest time, I thought my husband's best friend, Arav, was someone I could trust without question. Arav had been in my husband's life for as long as I could remember. They had been childhood friends, inseparable since their teenage years. He was the kind of friend who would drop everything to help in times of need. He had stood beside us during our wedding, laughed with us in our happiest moments, and supported us through the toughest times. To me, he was like a brother. He was always polite, always charming, always safe. Or so I thought. If someone had told me back then that I would one day feel unsafe in his presence, I would have laughed it off. But looking back now, I can't help but notice all the small things I ignored, the lingering stares, the subtle comments, the moments that should have set off alarms in my head. But they didn't. Not until it was too late. The first signs. It was a rainy Friday evening when I first felt something was off. My husband had gone on a business trip for the weekend, and I was spending the evening alone, curled up with a book and a cup of tea. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of rain tapping against the windows. Then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. A strange feeling settled in my stomach as I walked to the door. When I opened it, Arav stood there, his clothes slightly damp from the rain, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you. I know your husband's out of town, so I figured you might need some company." His tone was casual, friendly, too friendly. Normally I wouldn't have thought twice about letting him in. He had visited countless times before, and my husband always trusted him around me. But something about this moment felt different. Still, I ignored my hesitation and stepped aside. "Come in. Do you want some tea?" "That would be nice," he said, closing the door behind him. As I walked to the kitchen, I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't the first time I had caught him staring, but tonight it felt more intense. I tried to shake off the unease as I poured tea into 2 cups. When I turned around, I almost flinched. He was standing too close. "You seem nervous," he said, tilting his head slightly. I let out a small laugh, trying to keep things light. "Not at all, just not used to unannounced visitors." He chuckled and took the cup from my hand. "I get it. It's strange being alone at night, right? Doesn't it scare you?" His words made my skin prickle. "No, not really," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I like the quiet." He took a slow sip of tea, his eyes still locked on me. "You sure? I mean, this house is pretty big. A lot of dark corners. A lot of places where someone could be hiding." A chill ran down my spine. I forced a smile. "You're trying to scare me, aren't you?" He smirked. "Just making conversation." Crossing the line. The evening continued with small talk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Arav kept steering the conversation in strange directions, asking questions he had never asked before. "Do you ever feel lonely when he's not home? Do you think your husband really understands you? You deserve to be seen, you know." Each question made my pulse quicken. Why was he talking like this? Then, as I stood up to grab my phone from the coffee table, I felt it, his fingers wrapping around my wrist. I froze. His grip wasn't tight, but it was firm enough to send a warning. "Arav, what are you doing?" My voice was barely above a whisper. He held my gaze for a moment before letting go, laughing softly. "Relax, it's just a joke." But it didn't feel like a joke. I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped back, creating distance between us. "It's getting late. You should probably go." For a second I thought I saw a flicker of something dark in his eyes. Disappointment? Anger? But then he smiled again, the same charming, harmless smile he always wore. "Of course, I didn't mean to overstay my welcome. As he walked to the door, he paused. His voice was lower when he spoke next. You know, you don't have to tell your husband I was here. It's not a big deal. A pit formed in my stomach. Why would I hide that? I asked. He shrugged. Some things are just better left unspoken. And then, just like that, he was gone. But the unease he left behind, it stayed. Doubt and fear. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke, the way he grabbed my wrist like he had every right to. Was I overreacting, or was something truly wrong? I told myself that maybe it was nothing, that maybe I had misread the situation. Arav had always been a little playful, a little teasing. Maybe he was just being friendly. But deep down, I knew something had shifted that night, and it was only the beginning. The next section will push the tension further, revealing how his behaviour escalates and how she finally realises she is not safe. Let me know if you want any adjustments before I continue. The next evening, just as I was beginning to feel normal again, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a second I froze, my heart skipping a beat. What if it was him again? Shaking off the thought, I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Arav. He stood there, hands tucked into his pockets, looking completely at ease, as if last night had never happened. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct in me screamed, "Don't open it." But how could I refuse? He was my husband's best friend. If I started acting strange, wouldn't that raise questions? Taking a deep breath, I pulled the door open. "Hey, what's up?" He smiled, but something in his eyes felt different this time. "I was in the neighbourhood, thought I'd drop something off." I glanced at his hands, empty. "Oh, what is it?" I asked cautiously. His smile didn't falter. "I figured we didn't get to finish our conversation yesterday. Thought I'd check in on you." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "You didn't need to," I said quickly. "I was actually about to go to bed." "At 7 p.m?" he chuckled, stepping forward just slightly. I stiffened. He noticed. A flicker of amusement passed through his expression, as if he liked that I was nervous. "You gonna let me in?" I didn't want to. I really didn't want to. But I found myself stepping aside anyway. The conversation that felt off. As he walked in, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I perched on the edge of the couch while he made himself comfortable, stretching his arms across the backrest like he owned the place. "So, does it ever bother you?" he asked. I blinked. "What?" "You know, being alone here, a big house, just you and the dark corners." A shiver ran down my spine. "I don't mind it," I said carefully. "Really?" His gaze was heavy, too heavy. "I always thought women didn't like being alone at night." I forced a smile. "We're not in a horror movie, Arav." He smirked. "Aren't we?" Something about the way he said it sent chills down my arms. I glanced at the clock. "It's getting late." "You're always trying to get rid of me." His tone was light, but there was something underneath it. I let out a nervous laugh. "Not at all, just tired." "Your husband's lucky." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His fingers drummed against the couch. "He gets to have you all to himself." The air in the room changed. "Arav, do you ever think he doesn't appreciate you enough?" My heart started to race. "You deserve to be seen, you know." I swallowed hard. This was not normal. "I think you should go." My voice was firmer this time. He tilted his head. "I was just making conversation." "It doesn't feel that way." For a second I thought I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Annoyance? Disappointment? Then, in the next instant, it was gone. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'll leave." I exhaled, relief washing over me. But as he walked to the door, he paused. "By the way, you don't have to tell your husband I was here." A pit formed in my stomach. "Why would I hide that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some things are just better left unspoken." Then he was gone, but the unease he left behind, it stayed. Doubt and fear. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the way he looked at me, the way his voice dropped lower when he spoke, the way he had grabbed my wrist the night before. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I had misunderstood, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong it was about to get. A few days passed, and just when I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined things, maybe I had overthought it, the universe gave me an answer. My husband came home one evening and casually mentioned, "Arav's dropping by later. Hope that's okay." My body stiffened. "Oh, yeah, sure. Of course he was coming." And when he did, it was like nothing had changed. He laughed with my husband, cracked jokes, and acted like the perfect best friend. But every now and then I caught him watching me, his eyes lingering just a second too long, his gaze unreadable, almost amused. I kept my distance, busying myself in the kitchen. At one point I felt him behind me before I even turned around. "Need any help?" he asked. I jumped slightly, my hands gripping the counter. "No, I'm fine." I forced a smile, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me. Just watching. "Your husband is lucky." His voice was low, quiet. My stomach twisted. "Not this again." "What do you mean?" He tilted his head. "You're different." I wanted to tell him to stop. But before I could, my husband called from the living room. "Babe, can you grab us some beers?" Arav smirked. "Guess we'll finish this conversation later." I didn't reply, but I knew it wasn't over. That Friday, my husband had to work late. I told myself it was just another evening, but deep down I felt uneasy. By 9 p.m, rain had started to pour. I curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book. Then, ding dong. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Arav! My pulse spiked. I didn't move. Maybe if I just stayed quiet, he'd leave. But then, "I know you're home." My throat went dry. I hesitated, but eventually I cracked the door open just slightly. "What are you doing here?" My voice came out weaker than I intended. He smiled, his hair damp from the rain. "It's pouring outside. Mind if I stay for a bit?" I didn't want to, but how could I say no without making things worse? I forced a nod, stepping aside. He walked in, shaking water from his jacket. The air felt thick. I stayed near the doorway. "Your husband still at work?" he asked casually. I nodded. Must get lonely," I swallowed. "Not really," he chuckled. "You're always so tense around me." I didn't respond, I just wanted him to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he took a seat on the couch, stretching out like he belonged there. "Come sit," he said. I didn't move. Come on, I won't bite. Everything in me screamed no, but I sat at the very edge of the opposite chair, as far as possible. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" He smirked. I clenched my fists. Why was he doing this? Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Can I ask you something?" I didn't answer. "Do you ever feel like your husband doesn't really see you?" My heart pounded. "What?" I managed to say. "I mean, does he really understand you?" His voice was smooth, calculated. "Of course he does." He tilted his head, studying me. "I don't think he does." I felt sick. This wasn't happening. "You should go," I said, my voice sharper now. He didn't move. Instead, he stood up and stepped toward me. I got up immediately, but he was faster. He was in front of me before I could move away. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his smirk sending chills down my spine. My breath hitched. My back hit the wall. For a second, I couldn't breathe. His eyes were too close, too intense. "Arav, move!" He didn't. I felt his fingers lightly graze my arm, slow, deliberate, too familiar. "You don't have to pretend, you know." My stomach twisted. "Pretend what?" I whispered. "That you don't like the attention." I felt like I was going to be sick. "Get out." I forced the words through gritted teeth. For a moment he just stood there looking amused. Then he laughed, as if this was all a joke. Finally he took a step back, raising his hands. Relax, just messing with you." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at him, my body frozen in place. "You don't have to tell your husband about this," he said casually, as if he hadn't just crossed every possible boundary. My fists clenched. "Get out!" His smirk widened. "As you wish." And then he walked out. The second the door closed, I locked it, and then I sank to the floor, shaking. I sat on the floor, still shaking. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. I should have done something sooner. I should have screamed, pushed him harder, fought back, but fear had paralyzed me. And now he was gone. Or was he? I stayed there, listening, straining to hear past the rain hammering against the windows. Was he really gone? Or was he standing just outside, waiting? Then, a knock. My body locked up. "Number, no." I swallowed, forcing myself to move, slowly. My footsteps were almost silent as I crept toward the door, peeking through the peephole. Nothing, just darkness. Maybe it was the wind, maybe... Ding dong. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. It wasn't the wind. And then my phone rang. I jumped so hard my back hit the wall. I yanked it out of my pocket. My husband's name was on the screen. Relief flooded through me. I swiped to answer, whispering, "Hello? Hey babe, I'm almost home." And then the phone wasn't in my hands anymore. I gasped, spinning around. Arav stood right there holding my phone, inside my house. My blood ran cold. "There's no one to call now," he whispered. I couldn't breathe. How did he get in? I had locked the door, hadn't I? "You look scared," he murmured, mocking me. My chest tightened. I wasn't scared, I was furious, and then I saw it, a heavy glass candle holder on the table. He was too close. If I hesitated, I'd lose my chance. I lunged. I grabbed the candle holder and swung it with everything I had. Crack! It smashed into his arm. He let out a curse, dropping the phone. I didn't wait. I ran, my bare feet slammed against the wooden floor as I sprinted toward the door. "Don't you dare!" I ripped it open and burst outside. The rain was pouring cold and relentless, soaking my clothes instantly. I didn't care, I ran. My mind screamed one word, "Run!" I tore across the yard, breathing hard, slipping slightly on the wet grass. Then, a voice. "Hey, what's going on?" I nearly sobbed in relief. My neighbour, Mr. Patel, was standing on his porch. "Help me," I cried. "Please!" He rushed forward just as Arav appeared in the doorway. For a second, everything went dead silent. Arav didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me. Then his lips curled into that same twisted smirk, and he turned around and walked away, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just tried to trap me in my own home. "Are you okay?" Mr. Patel's voice pulled me back. I nodded, but I was trembling. "Come inside," he said firmly. "I'll call your husband." My husband arrived minutes later. He barely parked the car before he was out, running toward me. "What happened?" His voice was sharp, urgent. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I was still in shock, so Mr. Patel explained instead. My husband's face went from confusion to rage. Without a word, he turned and stormed toward the house. "Wait!" I grabbed his arm. "He's gone!" But my husband wasn't listening. He threw the door open, searching every room. Arav was gone, but that wasn't the end. Not even close. The next morning, my husband filed a police report. I didn't want to. I just wanted to forget. But deep down, I knew Arav wouldn't stop, and I was right, because when the police looked into him, they found something chilling. I wasn't the first woman he had done this to. My stomach dropped as the officer explained. 3 years ago, another woman came forward, same story, same tactics. But she never pressed charges. She was too scared, the officer said. I felt sick. How many others were out there? How many stayed silent? Not me, not anymore. Arav was arrested. He tried to act innocent, pretending like it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence spoke for itself. And this time, he didn't get away with it. He was charged with unlawful entry, harassment, and attempted assault. I sat in the courtroom watching as they took him away. He looked at me one last time, still smirking. And then, he was gone. For good. I learned something that day. Sometimes the biggest danger doesn't come from strangers. It comes from those we trust the most. And now, I know better, I trust my instincts, and I'll never let anyone silence me again.